Hey, what is going on everyone, and welcome to a CSS Grid crash course. Now, just like my previous video, CSS FlexBox crash course, I'll be going through the basics and the most used cases of CSS Grid. Now, CSS Grid, exactly like CSS FlexBox, is a CSS technology which, well, makes our life much easier when we wish to display elements in a certain way. Now, if you wish to check out the previous video on FlexBox, I will leave a link in the description below. If not, then let's continue on with this video. So I just created here a empty folder. We call it CSS Grid. So let's just start off with creating an HTML file. And by the way, you can find the entire code for this video in the description below. So just go down there. If you wish, copy the entire code and just follow along. Enough code. If not, code along with me then. So let's create a index.html file. And by the way, if my audio is awful, is because I'm changing my setup and I'm back to my old Blue Yeti, which is, well, not the Blue Yeti Pro. And I think I'm just not setting it up correctly. I don't know why, but the sound is consistently awful. Okay, so we start out with a boilerplate. Now let's include up here our style.css. So let's include a link tag style.css, which will link up our CSS file style.css. And now let's also create this file by creating it up here, style.css. All right, now within our body, I'm just going to create a simple h1 and then a grid container, so a general div. So let's create an h1 within here. And by the way, I'm also using Emmet. If you're not familiar with Emmet, I also have a few videos about Emmet, and I also have an entire course on Visual Studio Code where I'm explaining Emmet and giving a few good examples of it. So let's type in here CSS Grid Crash Course. And yes, Emmet is what you just saw in there. Okay, now let's create a general div with a class of dot for class. As you can see, we're using Emmet again. Class for main-container, and within our main container we're going to have 9 elements. So this is what we're going to achieve at the end of our HTML. So let's create one div with a class of grid element. So when we're displaying something as grid, we're actually targeting the elements within the grid container. So this is why I'm wrapping everything into a container. Okay, now very important, I'm going to also use Emmet to multiply this, so star 9, and this will give me, you can see Emmet automatically returns 9 elements. Okay, so we're having this. Let's also open it up using live server. So I'm using an extension called live server. Actually close up this part, which will just open up our HTML file in a different port. Right now we're at 5501 because our previous one was at 5500, as you can see up here. Okay, so let's go now into our CSS file because we're basically done with our HTML. So open up our CSS file, and right for the get-go, I'm going to copy in a couple of things. This is just a general reset. I don't want to waste that much time over it. So let's start up with a general reset, which will just reset. So star, the global selector, it's going to select everything. It's going to take out the margins. So let me comment this out and check it out. You can see we have here some margins, up here some margins, some paddings. If we're using the general reset, all of that is gone. So margins and padding will going to be set to 0. Also box size, I'm going to set to border box, and I usually don't want any list styling. So the dots on a UL, LI elements, and also no text decoration. So any kind of anchor tag should not have any kind of text decoration. Now for the body itself, we're going to set it as font family of sans serif. It's going to have a max width of 900 pixels, and it's going to have margins of auto. And let me drag this to here and here, so you can see it much better. And do I need to zoom this in a bit? Now we're going to set it later on. Okay, now for H1, which we created up here, so our title, we're going to set text align to the center, font weight will be bold, font size will be 4 rem, margins 2, top and bottom 0 left and right. Also have a CSS course, a general web development course. If you wish to check it out, I'm going to leave a link in the description below where I'm explaining all of this in much more depth. Now padding 1 rem, all around padding, background color, a RGB color of bluish, and a white color then for the text. Now let's go to our main container, so this class right here. Now let's select it using dot main dash container, and within here we're going to just give it a general, this is just a general styling for the container. So I'm going to set the background color to a hash 2466 D4. But you know what, I'm losing a lot of time on this. I really want to make this video as short as possible and focus on CSS Grid. So I'm going to copy in the rest of the settings. So we'll have a box shadow, I'm sorry about that, a general box shadow for our main container, main containers, sorry about that, a blue background color, and a height of 600 pixels. Now for the grid elements themselves within it, let's do a general setting of solid. You can see all of the elements are up here because they don't have any height. Okay. Now next up, let me select each one of them and give them a different color. So we're going to go with, going to select each grid element. I'm going to select from it its nth child because I want to be able to select the odds and the evens. Okay, so let's first of all select the odds, and we're going to give them a background color of red. Let's just save, and there we go. There's our red ones. Those are just small lines, and we're going to do the same thing. Copy this, change it to even. I'm going to change this to, let's say, white. Okay. Now you will see them appear just in a second, and it's time to get to our main container. So when we wish to display something as grid, it should be the container of the elements. So if you have multiple elements and you wish to display them as grid, you need to set them in one container, and you're always targeting the container, which is the parent element. Okay. So now that we've selected our main container, we could just display as grid. Type in display grid. Now this is going to automatically display it as a grid. Now grid, as you can see, automatically displays everything in one column with as many rows as there are elements. Now by definition, the columns and rows of the grid with the space separator list. Now in general, we can define the columns and rows of a grid with a space separated list of values. Okay, and the values themselves represent the track size, and the space between the track size are the grid lines. So in order for you to see this much better, I'm going to go do something. Right click on your browser. I'm using Google Chrome. You could usually use Firefox, but I wouldn't suggest using Internet Explorer or Opera. And this is because if you click here on view page source, then no, not view page source, I'm sorry about that, inspect. So click on inspect, you're going to get this inspector, and now I'm going to shrink this down even more. So code editor, this is one of the important thing is for you to see what is happening here. Should I snap it to the side? Make this even smaller. Yeah, let me snap it to, I also remain within here. Now you can change it either to be in the bottom of the page. So go into these three dots right here. This is the settings. You can change to be on the right side. Let's first of all leave it on the right side. Good to see. Now you can see as soon as I did this display as grid, let me comment this first of all out and take a look up in the right corner where you can see this grid. Okay, so if I comment this out, hit save, that grid option disappears from Google Chrome. Now this is actually not that new. I think it's a year old. This didn't exist. This grid option in the right side, only Firefox had it. So Google Chrome didn't have it. Now as I comment this back in, it will appear again. If I click on it, then take a look at the elements within it. We'll have, okay, can see it. Okay, there it goes. There it is. You can see those 1s and 2s. Those are the lines, and between them is the gutter, is the space between the elements. And we're going to go to this really quickly. Now, actually, I could close this. So close this up. It actually disappears. So let me click it back in. Let me have this active. I'm going to minimize it. So I think that's okay. So I just want to have it, and I will also suggest for you to have it active. So let's go back in our editor. Next up, we're going to change up how the grid is displayed, and we can actually target. So by remaining within our main container, within our parent element, we can actually target the columns. So in order to do this, we need to type in grid template and column, and this will only select the columns of our grid. Now this means that we're going to separate our grid elements into multiple columns, and these multiple columns could be any number that we wish. So we could separate it, for example, in 2 columns, but we need to define the width of the column. We could either do this by typing in, let's say, 200 pixel would be first column, and the second should be 100 pixel. Okay, so if I hit save, we'll see we have 2 columns with first of all, the first column being 200 pixels and the second one being 100 pixels. I can change the second or the first one. Let's change this to 300 pixels and the column will grow. Now, please keep in mind that we have a max width of 900 pixels for our body. This is where everything lives. This is why the container has enough space to the right side. Now, if I would change let's change the first column to 400 pixels. Now, these two combined are 700 pixels. 400 plus 300 is 700 pixels. Now, let's say I wish to have a third column. We have 400, 300, 700 pixels. Now, for it to have 900, we could do a third column with 300 pixels. And now we have first column with 400, second with 300, and the last one with 400. We could also do the same thing by changing this 200 to, let's say, auto. And what this will do is going to fill out the blank space with all of the columns. Okay, so we could now actually do multiple columns. Let's say we can insert the next column, let's say 100 pixels. So if I hit save, you can see the first one will have 400, the second 300. The third one will be auto, and the last one will be 100 pixel. Now I could still change this to 200, and well, the third column will disappear, but I could change it to 150. Whoa, that's a bit too much. Then we will have the third column will be, well, 50 pixels. It will be the rest of what remains. Now we could also, let's go with a smaller column size. So let's change this to 80. Then let's go for the second one with, let's just play around, 150. Then let's leave this at auto. Let's go with 250 pixels and 600 pixels. Okay, and then we will have something like this. Now let's go to grid. Let's see if we wish to change the rows. We could do something like grid. Let me actually scroll up here a bit. So grid template rows. And now again, as we did before this, we can insert certain numbers in order for us to define the rows. So, but I still want to show you that we could also do percentage. So if I would tell it to be 25%, then the first row will be 25%, and the next one will be 75%, for example. Now I could also do, let's say, change this to 100 pixels, so we can mash it up. We have 25%, the next one will be 100 pixels. And let's say we want a third column, and I could type in here auto. And the third one will be a auto column. But now I need to take out the last column in order for us to have a third column. So I need to take out the last row. Also, let's take out this one. And then we have 3 columns and 3 rows. Now we could also do something like, and if I comment this out, let's comment this part out, and let's say we do a grid template row of, let's say, 300 pixels for the first row, and then auto for the next one. Okay, now if we wish to have, for example, three columns which have the same width, we could do something like grid template columns, sorry, it's multiple, and let's say we have 200 pixels, 200 pixels for the second one, and 200 pixels for the third one. Okay, so we would have three equal columns. Actually, let's change this to 300, 300, 300 in order to have the complete width. Now, we could do something else. Instead of doing this, we could do grid template columns, and now we can type in repeat. Let me make this just a bit smaller. Okay, so as I said, if you wish to have three of a kind, and within here we can now say repeat 3 times 300 pixels, and we'll get the same result. Now, in order to be sure, I can change this to 200, and you can see we have now repeated 200 pixels 3 times, and we have 3 columns. Now, 300 was the exact width of the entire container. We have 900 pixels and we filled it up with 300 pixels. Now, let's say we wish to fill it up without giving it any kind of, now we could do something like fractions. Now, fractions are basically, let me show you here, grid template column, and let's say I'm going to do one fraction. Now we're going to have one column which takes up the entire width of the container because it's one fraction. Now, if I would do now another fraction, then we have two equal fractions. It's kind of like percentages, but it's going to always trim up the entire container into equal parts. Now, if I would do another fraction, then we will have three fractions. If this would be a 1000 pixels width container, then it would do something like 333.33333, and this multiplied with by 3 times. So as you can see, fractions are extremely useful. You can also do this for rows. Let me quickly show you this. So grid template rows. You could also do repeat. Let's say let's say 3 times one fraction, and this will divide the container into 3 equal fractions. That's pretty much it for grid template colors, grid template rows. Let's also talk about the gap, so the space between our items. In order to do this, first of all, I'm going to change our main container. Let's change this up to 2 columns and 1 fraction. Well, let's actually leave it at 3. And now I'm going to, first of all, change the gap between the columns. So for this, we need to type in column gap. And let's say we're going to give them a 10 pixel gap. So between the columns, we now have a gap of 10 pixels. Now, if we wish to give a gap between the rows, then I assuming you already guessed it, we could type in row gap, and we're going to give this, let's say, 20 pixels. Now we have 20 pixels between the rows. Now, this is no longer use column and grid gaps. Actually, what we do use is just gap. Okay, and basically, first of all, what we type in is the row. So if I wish to have the exact same effect, let me comment this one out and this one out. First one is going to be the row, so 20 pixels. And then if we give, the next one will be columns. So let's type in here 10 pixels, hit save, and you can see I have the same effect. Now, if I wish to do a all around gap, so columns and rows, let me copy this. And now we have 20 pixels for the columns and the rows. Okay, so this basically means rows and columns if I only type in one value. Now let's talk about justify content. Now exactly as in Flex, Grid, CSS Grid also has justify content and justify items, sorry about that. And justify items is going to align the grid items along the main axis, which is the row axis. So in order to do this, we need to target first of all our elements and give them a width. So let's say grid elements class is going to target all of our elements. I'm going to give them a width of 100 pixels. Now let's start up by justifying the content, and for this we're going to grab onto our main container again. Justify items. Now let's type in justify items, and let's start out with, well, start. Okay, and this will, because it's a default settings, we can't say any changes. But now if I would do justify items and let's say end, it's going to push the items to the end of the row axis. Now I could do something like center, justify item, center, and this will push everything, each item in the center of the axis. Okay, next up, let's take a look at align items. Let's type in here comment. I also forgot to type in here the comment of justify items. Now let's go down here and let's type in another comment of justify of align items. Align items. Now what align items will do is going to align our items along the block axis, which are the column axis. So let me comment everything out from up here. This is save. I'm going to target the container again, and also let me just copy this, comment out the width. Now let's type in align items. I'm going to first of all comment out the width, and we're going to change now the width to, let's set it as width and auto. Okay, so there will be now stretch within the container. But what I'm going to do is going to give them a height of 100 pixels. Okay, so there are items, they have only 100 pixels for their height. Now let me comment out this and also delete it. And now let's start out by aligning our items to, let's say, the start, which is not flex start, just start, which is up in the column. Then after that we can align our items to the end, which will push them down in the column. Exactly as we had with justify items, we can also align our items to the center, which will align them in the center. Now if we had no height defined, if we comment this out, if we had no height defined for our items, then we could do align items, and let's set them as stretch. Hit save. As you can see, they're stretched out for the entire container. Okay, now next up, let's talk about justify content. And sometimes the total size of your grid might be less than the size of your grid container. Now this could happen, for example, if you have all of your grid items defined as non-flexible units, which are, for example, pixels. Okay, so in this case, you can now set the alignment of the grid within the grid container. So let's target first of all our grid elements again. And now let's set a height. Now let's set a height of 100 pixels. Okay, I'm going to scroll up here. Now let's target our main container again. And first of all, I'm going to change something. So let's change our grid template columns to, let's say, repeat. I'm going to repeat 3 times 200 pixels, which will not fill out the entire grid container. And also I'm going to do the same thing for the rows. So grid template rows, I'm going to repeat 3 times 200 pixels. Let's also change the gap. Let's say 0. We're going to take out the entire gap. And now we have a container without any gaps, and also our items are less than the entire width or height of the container. Okay, now let's start with justifying the content to the start, which is our default setting. After that, we're going to take a look at end, which will now push the entire, all of the items to the end of the container. So now we're targeting the container itself. We could also do justify content center, which will push now all of the items into the center of the container. And the next 3 are the most used cases. So we have justify content with space around, which will give space around the items. But this is actually going to give space, equal space around the items, and the rest of the space will be split up within the margins of the container. Now the next thing will be space between. So justify content and space between, which will give equal space between the elements and 0 space to the left and right of the container. And the last one will be justify content with space evenly, and this will give equal space between the items and to the left and right of the container. Okay, so I hope this makes sense. Now the last property that I wanted to show you is align content. So let's type in here another comment. Align content. This is pretty much like justify content. And did I type in here comment align items? No, I did not. Why didn't I do this? So up here we'll have justify content. Okay, and down here we have our align content, and this is pretty similar to align to justify content, and exactly as we have in our justify content. So this is pretty similar to justify content. So let me just actually show you. First of all, I'm going to take our main container again. And let's see, do I need to comment something out? No, this is perfect. But what I will do is copy this too and change the height to 100 pixels for the column and 150 pixels for the rows. Okay, let's hit save. So you can see now our items are not only in the height, but also in the width less than the container. Okay, so let's start off with align items to the end. Oh, sorry, not align items, align content to the end. Not flex end, we're not using FlexBox. Okay, this will push it down. And if I do align content to the start, then this will push it again back up because the start is the default settings. So next up is align content to the center, which will push everything in the center of the container. Okay, so exactly as we had in justify content, we can now align the content with space around, which will give space around the items, but the space left and right is going to be split up into equal amounts. Then we have align content with space between, should give equal space between the items, and last but not least, align content with space evenly, which will give even space between the elements and its container. Okay everyone, so hope you enjoyed the video. Hit the thumbs up button if you did, subscribe to my channel, and click that notification bell in order to get notified when we post new videos. So with this being said, catch you next time. Bye bye.